Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Queen's for the UAS lecture series for 2025. It's lovely to see so many of you here, and welcome to those who are listening in online as well. I'll just go through the usual housekeeping bits and bobs before we start. So can I just ask you please to make sure that you've got a mobile on you, please turn it to silent or off for the duration of the lecture. Likewise, online, if you could please make sure that you're muted. We're not expecting any problems in the building this evening, but if by any chance the fire alarm should go off or be any emergency, please just note that the exits are two at the top of the lecture theatre, one on either side and down at the bottom here. The recce point is out in the car park at the front of the building. So if you could please make sure you sign the attendance sheet, which is being passed around, just so it can make sure that we know that everybody's accounted for if there should be a problem. As I say, we're not anticipating any problems, but just in case. Right, in that case, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Greer Ramsey. He started his undergrad degree in archaeology here at Queen's in 1978. Which slightly shocked me. I thought he was much younger than that, and went on to complete his PhD with a thesis of Middle Bronze Age weaponry in Ireland in 1989. He worked for the Archaeology Survey in Belfast before starting his career in the museum sector. This began in the Fermanagh County Museum in Enniskillen before moving to Armagh, where he was curator of the Armagh County Museum and curatorial advisor to the Robinson Library until 2014. Since then, Greer has returned to Belfast as Curator of Archaeology at the National Museums Northern Ireland. His role covers an entire archaeological collection from the Mesolithic to the later medieval period. And this role includes the recording and identification of finds made by members of the public and dealing with the treasure items in the coroner's court. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his lecture this evening. So thank you, Greer, hand over to you.
First of all, can I just check, as I say that, can you hear me okay? Everything grand? Well, first of all, thanks very much indeed for welcoming me this evening and me a chance to speak to the Society. And what we're going to cover tonight, we're going to look at the 1996 Treasure Act and some of the objects that the museum has acquired under the Act. Most of the objects that you will see tonight are on display in the permanent galleries. And we also have a small exhibition of treasure also in the Ulster Museum at the moment. Now, I deliberately started off with, some people might recognize the image of Long John Silver from Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. The reason why I picked that is because the term treasure can conjure up this idea of, if you find some item of treasure, you're going to be able to retire for the rest of your days. But of course, that's rarely, if ever, the case. But there is also, to a certain extent now, I think, a blur in the line between, I suppose, archaeology and the Antiques Roadshow. But what really then is the primary reason for the Treasure Act? What is it trying to do? Well, you can see here that the Treasure Act, it really provides a level of protection to archaeological objects found by members of the public if they meet the definition of treasure. So it's providing a level of cover to archaeological objects. Objects that are declared treasure by the coroner cannot be kept by the finder or the landowner, but there will be an opportunity for them to be offered to museums. The museums will usually have to pay a financial reward to the finder and landowner if they want to acquire the objects, or otherwise they will be returned. And the Treasure Act applies only to England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and almost exclusively to metal objects. So to try to take one thing just out of all that bulk of information is that if a find is classified as treasure, it does not belong to the landowner, but is kept by the Crown pending a hearing. So you imagine then what other pieces of legislation cover our archaeological objects. And one is the Historic Monuments and Archaeological Objects Order. And that provides a notice to everybody, including myself and sitting here, that if you find an archaeological object, you're required to report it. Now, because the Act dates back to 1995, some of the names of the places that you reported to have changed slightly. One would say the director of the Ulster Museum. A relevant authority would have been then the Department of the Environment, now Historic Environment Division, or to the police. Now, if you went and reported to the police, they'd probably be as surprised as you are. But what really happens in effect now is most people report the objects to the museum. And the reason why they report them to the museum, it allows us to build up a picture of the past by recording objects found by members of the public. And usually when you find something, there could be one of two outcomes, giving us the opportunity to record it. And the only thing that we can do is hold on to the objects for a short period of time. Unless the object classifies as treasure, it will belong to the landowner. And then we may get into a negotiation as to whether the object may be donated or more frequently purchased. What really then classifies as treasure? Well, under the 1996 Act, there's something also called the Code of Practice. And the 1966 Act sets out some of the detail, but the Code of Practice is like a really thick working manual. And if you can go online, it'll tell you basically everything you need to know about the process. But we're going to start off now with the first and the most simplest definition. And in order for an object to classify as treasure, it must be at least 10% precious metal. That means it must be basically gold or silver. And it has to be at least 300 years old. Coins are slightly more unusual. They're gold and silver, they have to be 2 or more. If they're a base metal, which is essentially copper, they have to be 10 or more. Don't be getting panicky about thinking that I'm just going to go through and talk about more detail after other. But even if you just remember as a starting point, well, forget about the coins. Coins will be complicated. That the basis definition of treasure, objects over 300 years old that are made of gold or silver. So imagine you were out and you were lucky enough to find an object. Maybe you could find as people have done, a nice item of prehistoric gold. Well, the first thing that you would have to do, no matter what the object is, treasure or not, is report it to the museum. And we can then gather all the relevant information. We will try to identify the object and see if it meets the definition of treasure. If it meets the definition of treasure, we'll inform the coroner, and the coroner will request a curatorial report. And that's basically what the coroner wants to know is, what the object is, what is it made from, does it meet the basic definition of treasure, which comes from its age, and is it made of precious metal? But the coroner in the past in Northern Ireland also required legal statements to be taken. And in the past, they would have been taken by the PSNI. So if you were the finder, the police would have interviewed you, your name, your details, had you permission to be on the land. If you were the landowner and where the object was found, had the person be permission, what are the details? If necessary, can you demonstrate that you are the landowner? So the museum would do that now really on behalf of the coroner. When all that information is gathered, we'll end up in the coroner's court. It's quite an interesting experience, I think, for the finder and landowner. You'll be sworn in and giving your basic evidence. And the coroner really is there primarily to make a decision as to whether the object meets the definition of treasure. But we wouldn't go as far as going to the coroner's court unless we were pretty confident that that was going to be the outcome. And then what happens, it used to be that the objects were physically taken to the British Museum. So the British Museum administer the treasure process on behalf of the Crown. But nowadays, and really it was a result of COVID, they're happy to deal with photographs of the images. And they're verified by the Treasure Valuation Committee. Sometimes we get accused maybe of, you are just valuing yourselves. The Treasure Valuation Committee is an independent committee, independent of the British Museum. And they will contact all the interested parties, the finder, the landowner, the museum, with the valuation. And if we want to acquire the object, we have to come up with the money. And the regulation says that it's a 50-50 financial split. And then the museum pays the money and it acquires the object. So we'll leave the legislation aside a little bit for the moment. And we'll go on now and look at some objects that the museum has acquired under the Act and why these classify as treasure. The next slide may be, you may be, well, why am I showing a slide of a burial, a 5th millennium BC burial in Bulgaria? Well, this is the Varna burial, and the reason really why I'm showing it is you can see that the person in the grave is bedecked with gold objects. And some of these objects are placed on the body, so we can be quite reasonably clear how they might be used. And so we might be able to see, if we can see it as a headdress, we can see arm rings, we can see what looks like a scepter, gold objects, and I describe it as for the Christmas present for the man who has everything, a gold penis sheath. But why am I showing this? Well, the problem is when we go to look at this material in a European context, and particularly an Irish context, almost the further we go west, and when we reach Ireland, very, very few, if any, gold objects from the Bronze Age or any metal objects are either buried with the dead, found on settlements, or found on excavations. So it then becomes more of a challenge to work out how some of the nice gold objects are worn. And that would be the case with, I suppose, it's the heaviest gold object in the collection. It's the townland is Carrrr, which is near the Belle Isle estate near Enniskillen. It's a gold object dating to the sort of Middle Bronze Age, somewhere around 1300, 1100 BC, 720 grams of gold. So it meets the definition of treasure because we can demonstrate that it's over 300 years old. And as we will see, we can demonstrate that it's made of precious metal. When we analyze the Carrrr torque, we can see that it's 80%, 87% gold, 11% silver, and 2% copper. And one of the things that I find interesting about the concept of gold and analyzing gold, perhaps you were like me originally when you think, look, is gold just not gold? And if you were to take a grain of gold found anywhere in Ireland, if you were to take a nugget of gold out of the ground found anywhere in Ireland, figures according to Richard Warner would indicate that it has silver occurring as a natural element anywhere between 5 and 16%. So there is no such thing as pure gold. It will always have an element of silver in it. You can also see that the Carrrr torque has 2% copper. Again, if we were to take this analogy of a grain of gold or a nugget of gold, you would only expect to find copper less than 2% or less than 1%. And that means that it's a minor trace element. So copper really has been added probably incidentally as somewhere in the casting process. We wouldn't expect copper at 2% from a natural piece of gold. We do know that modern jewelers would add copper to change the color, but at 2%, it would have no effect. And that brings us on to the whole concept of the carat system that we were familiar with if you're visiting a jeweler. So the Carrrr torque is around 87% gold, which is 21 karat gold. And that's considered by jewelers to be a really, really good quality gold to work with. Gold has a number of intrinsic properties that are favored by metalsmiths. The most obvious is that it doesn't corrode, but it's also highly malleable. And what that means is when you hammer it and you work at it, all metals will gradually harden, but gold takes longer to harden, for example, than copper and bronze. And you can counteract this process of hardening by heating it, and that's the process called annealing. So 87% gold, really, really good quality gold. How then do you really create a torque? And some of the lovely images of the torque here, we'll see that in its current state, it can't be worn on the body anywhere. But essentially, the torque is really made by hammering. It's not made primarily by casting. So essentially, you start off with a long square bar of gold that would be cast. And although this is a kind of a stylized representation, but purely by the process of hammering, you want to change the square bar into a cross. And I had the privilege of seeing this done by a silversmith called Brian Clark. You can see that he's actually working here in copper because we couldn't afford gold, but all done with hammering. So he starts off with a square bar, He's made already terminals at the end, which we'll see here. And he takes a chisel and he chisels the whole way down the 4 faces. So the whole way down turns, the whole way down turns. So he turns the square bar into a cross. And all he does then, it's kind of magic, is that when he twists it from either end, it forms a natural spiral, a bit like fusilli pasta. When I was watching him do it, when he turned, he could turn easily at the start, and then it would harden and he had to reheat it. Emphasizing, I say, that gold is easier to work than copper or bronze. But the really interesting thing about the carved torque is that it's in a coiled condition. And it's the only coiled torque from the whole of Ireland. If we were to uncoil it, it would be 47.5 inches. And we're not sure, to bring back the Varna analogy, is it worn around the neck? Was it worn around the waist? Was it worn by men or women? We don't know. But if we were to uncoil it, it would look very much like this example from County Kildare. And it has 2 clasps at the top that allow it to be opened and closed like the belt of a buckle. Why on earth was it coiled? Well, we don't really know why it was coiled. Coiled torques are more familiar in England and Wales, for example, as in the Burton hoard. And here you can see a coiled gold torque. Notice it's only something like 92 grams of gold compared to our 720. And it's found with 3 Middle Bronze Age Paul staves, some other gold objects, and the base of a pot. So the inference being that it may have been coiled to be carried in the pot. If you wanted to bury the carved torque, you'd have to bury and dig a huge hole. Much easier to wind it up and bury it. And when I spoke to Brian Clark, the metalsmith, he said it's very easy for a metalsmith to unwind that torque and make it usable again. So perhaps the reason for it being coiled, really like a penicillin, there's a kind of a funny story. When the guy found it, he took it to a jeweler in Enniskillen, and the jeweler in Enniskillen told him that it wasn't made of gold. So I don't particularly recommend that jeweler. Making the point that Ireland was renowned for the quality and quantity of its gold work in the Bronze Age. It was called the El Dorado of Western Europe. And when George Ogan published a book called The Accomplished Art, there were something like 1,000 gold objects from Ireland and only 500 from Britain and Wales. Scotland is very gold objects. So there's a real proud tradition in gold work in Ireland, beginning sometime before 2000 BC. Continuing the theme of prehistoric gold, but this time we're working really on a miniature scale. This is the Inch gold bulla. Inch is near Downpatrick. This was discovered around 2008. It dates to the later part of the Bronze Age, maybe somewhere between about 950, 800 BC. So it's over 300 years old. It's made of gold, therefore it's classified as treasure. But it's only 2 by 3 centimeters. You could hold it in your hand. And what's really remarkable about it is the ability to work on a miniature scale without the modern aid of glasses or a magnifying glass. Of course, the bulla is really made of 2 parts. It's like a heart or bag-shaped body, and it has a tube along the top. And where the front and back join here, there are 13 strands of gold wire, and these are almost nearly impossible to count with the naked eye. So you had to have really good eyesight to work this. And then that raises the question, if people in the past were like ourselves and our eyesight deteriorated with time, were there younger people specializing in making this jewelry? The back is plain, but the front has 9 little concentric discs. And in the middle of each disc, there's a pin. So we had the bulla X-ray just to see if it was hiding anything inside, but unfortunately it wasn't. All it has is a clay core. And the reason it has a clay core is this is a very delicate object. It's made from sheet gold. So the clay core gives it a bit of strength. And it has a tube along the top. We hadn't cleared out the soil. So we can be pretty confident that it was worn around the neck. These objects are incredibly rare. There are only 6 others, and they're all known from Ireland. And we can see the G is the Inch bulla. And in looking at some of these, some of them are really like peas in the pod. And the closest analogy we have to the Inch bulla is one from Arrrr in County Tyrone. So you can see here the inch bulla is the white background and the one from Arrrr is the black background. And they look to almost intents and purposes identical, except the pins from the Arrrr one are missing. And this raises the distinct possibility that they may have been made in the same workshop. So they're incredibly important objects and really, really skillfully produced. We'll move on again. We're staying on the theme of Bronze Age gold. And we're looking now at two objects, one found in Newton Ards, the other found near Warnpoint. And there are about 100 of these objects from Ireland. They date again to the later part of the Bronze Age, somewhere between 950 and 800 BC. And they're referred to as sleeve fasteners. The term sleeve fastener, like many of the terms for the prehistoric gold, it's an older antiquarian term, and it's reflecting the fact that we are not exactly certain how they were used. But one of the analogies you can see from the line drawing is perhaps they were used a bit like a cufflink. And having said that, prehistoric gold rarely, if ever, turns up in an excavation. The Killymoon excavation is an exception to that. It was published, there's a very nice article published by Declan Hurl in Archaeology Ireland. And Killymoon, this is a little sleeve fastener from Killymoon, and it was found right beside what people now call like a dress fastener, perhaps a larger version. What's interesting about that, this was a classic late Bronze Age site. There were the other late Bronze Age objects, but the fact that these two objects are found together demonstrates that they're contemporary and may even have had a similar function. But very, very important objects. So just when you think you've got your head around the basis of the first definition of treasure, in 2002, it was extended. I wouldn't worry too much maybe about trying to read all the details, but the reason why it was extended is to bring other objects onto the net. So they decided that as well as to the basic definition, 300 years old, gold or silver, that they would include prehistoric hoards made of any metal. So that is essentially hoards from the Bronze Age or hoards from the Iron Age. They did not have to be made of gold or silver, but there had to be two or more. And one of the first objects that was heard under the new 2002 definition, and I happened to be working in Armagh County Museum in 2004 when it was brought in, is called the Tamla hoard. And Tamla is near, everybody would be aware of Navan Fort in County Armagh. So Tamla is a townland very near Navan Fort. And what essentially was found was a late Bronze Age sword. And sword is kind of a typical late Bronze Age sword. So we want to put dates on these somewhere around 1000 BC. And it was found with a bowl, a plain bowl, but inside the bowl was the decorated remains of a cup, and the cup appeared to have a handle. And then where it became interesting is we're not looking for the analogy of swords because there are plenty of them. It was, well, are there parallels to the bowl and are there parallels to the cup? And there were no parallels to the bowl or cup in Irish collections, none in Britain either, and none on the western seaboard of France. So the parallel to the bowl and the cup lay in Central Europe at around 1000 BC. And this is one of the bowls which has German parallels. I'll maybe not try the pronunciation. And this is the little handled cup. And the cup is decorated, and that's important itself because when you have details of decoration, it makes analogies easier. So you're more certain that you're comparing like with like. And you can see that the decoration on this is the handle from the Tamla cup, and it's very similar to examples from the Czech Republic. Again, the top image is a little bit of the decoration from the cup, and we can see parallels to the image from, let's see, these cups from Central Europe. And occasionally these can occur in very, very large, impressive hoards, like the hoards from Dresden. Sometimes an alcoholics drinking set. But hopefully where it'll really stand out is when you begin and think about the distribution map. So this is the distribution map of these cups and bowls. And prior to 2004, there wasn't the one spot in Armagh. But remarkably, somehow this bowl and cup has traveled the whole way across Europe. and is only known from Britain or Ireland from the Tamla hoard. And what's interesting about the geographical context of the Tamla hoard is the sites that are associated with it and the sites that are found close by. And this is a kind of a little illustration of the two key sites. So we have the Tamla hoard in around, all these are in around 1000 BC. And of course, close by Tamla, particularly people from Queens, which Queens excavated the hill fort, would be the Bronze Age hill fort of similar date, Hockey's Fort, with the three large ditches. But also connected to Hockey's Fort, and it was excavated by Chris Lynn and published in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology in the 1970s, is the King's Stables. And this is a kind of an unusual site. It has an earthen bank enclosing a kind of a stagnant pool of water. And from the pool have been recovered the severed head of a juvenile and molds for making Bronze Age swords. So there's probably very little doubt that whoever owned the Tamla hoard, the bowl, the cup, and the sword must have been in some way associated with Hockey's Fort, may have been involved in the rituals that took place at the King's Stables. But following a pattern of Bronze Age throughout Ireland, the objects were not buried with the dead, they were not found in the grave, but they were placed in boggy ground. And that's a pattern that repeats itself throughout the Irish Bronze Age. Much more simple objects. Again, these classify as treasure under the 2002 definition because they are part of a prehistoric Bronze Age hoard. I'm sure some people may recognize them. They're Bronze Age axes. And what they are missing is their handle that would allow them to be used. The little slide at the bottom here is the general idea of these are cast in an open stone mold, of course, missing now the wooden handles. But what proved interesting about the hoard is that these two axes, when they were analyzed, they are not made of bronze, they are made of copper. And copper is a comparatively soft metal. So bronze is essentially a mixture of copper and tin, and the tin would usually be less than 10%. This axe is also unusual in that it's giving a very, very high surface tin reading. And that brings us on to the whole concept that we tend not to think about is the color of objects and how may they've changed through time. So if you were ever to see a bronze object being cast, it just looks like gold. And it was mistaken in the past for gold. We know that tin, if it was deliberately added, may make the surface slightly shiny or silver. So the color of objects changed dramatically through time when they developed this patina, but the Corvallis hoard, it classifies as treasure because it's a prehistoric hoard, dating generally to around about 2000 BC. We're going to jump forward chronologically now to the Roman period in around the 4th and 5th century. And we're now at an important find that was found in 2014 in the Murlock sand dunes near Newcastle. And it consists of 3 objects. 2 of these objects are Roman gold rings. And the third, even though it doesn't look like silver, it is silver and it has been identified as part of a Roman sort of belt buckle. The 2 rings are of different size. The one with this sort of black stone is much larger than the one in the center. The one in the center is called an intaglio ring. The stone is an onyx and it has a little creature carved into the surface. The black glass has deteriorated, but it would no doubt have had some either illustration or portrait. But why Roman material is important in Ireland is, of course, because the Romans never invaded Ireland. And if you were to look at the archaeology, basically, of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, it has certainly similarities until it comes to the Roman period. When you visit museums in England and Wales and Scotland, they're coming down with Roman material. Roman material is very, very, very rare in Ireland. And therefore, where it does occur, it raises the question is, what was the nature of contact that brought it there? Did this belong to one person? Did it belong to 2 people? Did it belong to a soldier? Did the person drown? Was there a community in the Murlock sand dunes? Because we do get other objects. Or was it some kind of a ritual deposition? That may sound really unusual, but bizarrely, we do find other Roman rings buried towards the entrance of Newgrange, as if they were paying homage to an early site. So we don't know the reasons for the loss of the hoard, but it's important as a measure of really of contact with the Roman world. We're going to move on now and look at some Viking material. And the Viking period in Ireland, in general terms, we're talking around about 800 AD to around 1050 AD. And one of the main metals that's used in the Viking period is silver. And what we're looking at now, we're looking at three objects, one from Ballinderry in County Antrim, that's up the Glenavy end. You can just see three different views, and that's for a specific reason. And then we have two other objects, one from Downpatrick and one from near Kirkcudbright. Silver was the main metal used in the Viking world. And silver had a number of purposes. It can occur in ingot form, but it was often turned into, and the archaeological term they would use is ornaments. I still tend to think of it in terms of jewellery. And they can be called arm rings. We might want to think of them as bracelets. But they served a dual purpose. Yes, they would have been nice to wear, but one of their primary functions was to act as a form of currency based on weight. And if you have a currency based on weight, you have to have scales and you have to have weights. And there are scales and weights, for example, that was recovered from the Blackwater dredgings. And what makes then the Ballinderry arm ring particularly interesting is you can see this, it would have originally formed a C shape, but it has been very, very carefully and deliberately folded, indicating that its primary purpose when it was buried in the ground was probably no longer as an item of jewellery, but for its bullion or weight of silver. And we know that, I kind of think of it in the idea of small change, that we know that also that it was quite common for Viking metalsmiths to hack small amounts of these, giving us the concept of hacked silver. And we can see some hacked silver from Poodles near Achillee, where I live. And it also then reminds us that what have we to thank the Vikings for? Well, the first coins in Ireland were struck in the 990s in Dublin. And as coinage develops, so the concept of hacked silver really declines. The hoard from Carnacavel near Mackeraw, it's very important from a numismatics point of view. These are only two of a larger hoard that may have had many as 15 coins. And these coins were minted in the Isle of Man. So it's the first time this particular type of coins minted in the Isle of Man has been identified as clearly being found in Ireland, as opposed to being inherited through archaeological collections. Continuing with the Viking theme, a very, very tiny silver ring from Groomsport. And the whole area of Groomsport and Bangor area is interesting from a Viking point of view because we know that the Vikings were raiding Bangor in particular. And when this ring was first discovered, it really, really is tiny. I have small hands and I could just about go on my small finger. Until it was realized that perhaps it was never intended to be worn as a finger ring, because there is a very, very good parallel to it in a hoard from Garran Point. It's described as the lost hoard from Garran Point. We make the point that we never had it in the first place to lose it. It is just known from historical records. And even though this photograph looks like gold, it is in fact silver. And it contains a silver chain, and the chain is attached to a little silver pin by an absolutely identical ring. So it's likely that this wasn't a finger ring, it was part of a composite object. And of course, all these objects classify as treasure because they're older than 300 years and they're made of gold and silver. And I show the Viking gold ring. It was one of two from the Blackwater dredgings. And gold is much, much rarer in the Viking period. And we have some parallels to Viking gold rings from the Viking cemetery in Dublin, the largest Viking cemetery outside of Scandinavia. So we'll leave aside the Viking period for a moment and we'll move on again chronologically. So we're now up until around the 15th or 16th century into an object that you know, it's quite rare, but when one comes along, another comes along too. So we're dealing with another one as well. The little silver pendant, or they're sometimes known Agnus Dei or Lamb of God pendants. Now, slightly with the eye of faith, you might be able to work out the little face of the lamb. I don't know if you can see its little mouth and its ears. And apparently, and I always struggle in this one, the letters IHS, the first three letters in the Greek alphabet for the name of Jesus. But this would have been worn around the neck. It was intended to be strung. And it was like a reliquary. So it was designed to hold something religious. And we believe that it was designed to hold religious candle wax that had been used in candles on Easter Saturday and extinguished on Easter Sunday. And we do find similar objects. We have a lovely little Bible from the Girona, a little pendant that was used to design to hold sacred wax. But when you look at some of these objects, you'll notice that they have a brown tinge of them. And sometimes you think, gosh, like, am I confident that I have identified this correctly as silver? And silver can deteriorate over time, and it can get this brown tinge. And this was tested with XRF, and it was give a silver reading. And we decided in this case, we would maybe actually clean it up. And when you clean it up, you can clearly see that it is a silver object. So a religious pendant probably worn by a pilgrim, and that's from a find from County Fermanagh. We'll jump forward again we haven't talked too much about coin hoards. This is a very large coin hoard in Irish terms, only discovered a few years ago. 84 silver coins from the townland of Coolmagra near Kinbane Castle in County Antrim, a very spectacular castle if anybody has the chance to look at it or visit it. All the coins from this hoard are English coins with one exception. And the coins really range in date from 1551 to 1649. So we know therefore that the hoard has to be deposited after the last date of the hoard. So maybe in the 1650s. And this coincides in Ireland with what was known as the 11 Years' War, which had lasted from 1641 to 1652. So Ireland was fighting with England and Scotland as well. So at the 11 Years' War. And in times of trouble, we need more money to pay for armies. So there's usually more silver and coinage in circulation. And there's also some correlation that hoards increase in times of trouble. But the most interesting coin from the hoard is not an English coin. It's a German coin called a Bavarian thaler. And here we can see the two views of it. Apparently, these are more common on the continent, but rare, very rare in an Irish context. This is believed to be one of the first finds from a hoard. And what's interesting about the occupation of Kinbane Castle at this time, it was from the Catholic MacDonald clan. And the possibility is that the coin itself was valued for its religious symbolism of the kind of Madonna and child rather than any monetary value. Who owned the hoard, we don't know. Was it a fighting faction? Was it an individual soldier? But an important hoard nevertheless. So Treasure Act 1996, the extension to include prehistoric hoards in 2002. And we've looked at objects, chronologically, maybe up to the 15th, 16th century. But then really what happened particularly in England, there were two really important finds. And one is called the Crosby Guard Roman helmet. Now, I know very little about Roman archaeology, but a really, really rare object. We can read that it looks as if it was part of horse games. It does not, although it dates to around the 1st, 2nd century AD, it's older than 300 years old, but it doesn't classify as treasure. It's not made of gold or silver, and it's not from a prehistoric hoard. And this resulted in it was sold at public auction in Christie's for around 2 million. So there's no way that a museum could really compete with that. And similarly, they say the landlord could do with it what he wanted. Similarly, the Rydale hoard is another hoard, a Roman hoard from Northern England. We have, I think that it's the emperor is I think it to be Marcus Aurelius. I have the horse rider, I believe, to be one of the god Mars, and this little lead plumb bob. But this also sold at private auction, didn't classify as treasure, for around 185,000 to a private bidder, but it was later acquired by Ulster Museum. And really, when that happens, they often decide to review the Treasure Act to bring more objects under the treasure umbrella. And this happened in 2023, and it came into law on the 30th of July, 2023. And they decided they would create, in addition to, and this is where it began to get complicated, in addition to objects over 300 years made of gold and silver, in addition to prehistoric hoards, any gold object of any metal over 200 years could classify as treasure if you were able to mount an argument that it was highly, highly significant on a national level. Now, so far, we haven't put any of these objects to the test, but I'm going to take a particular analogy. So what classifies as being highly significant? Well, over 200 years old, objects would provide, I'm reading here, an exceptional insight to any aspect of natural or regional identity by rarity of the value, the location, providing exceptional insight into part of a group of objects. And there was a find that we have acquired, and we acquired it before the 2023, and it was found in 2018. And we had to get into negotiation with the landowner to acquire it. But I have no doubt that this find, we'll see in a minute, if it was found after the 30th of July 2023, we would have argued that it was a significant object and that the landowner should not have the right to hold on to it, recognizing also that the landowner and the finder is going to get a financial reward. And this is the female Viking burial from Rathlin Island. And I wanted to acknowledge Northern Archaeological Consultancy and Stephen Gilmore and Stuart Alexander, both for excavating and researching the site, but also for allowing us and helping us to negotiate its acquisition with the landowner. So this burial was found in around 2018 when a house was being developed. It's a female burial, estimated to be in around the age of 40, and didn't have a good day at the dentist. You can see that it has, Eileen Murphy's not here, she'll be able to keep me right, but it has a huge dental abscess. But they also noted that the teeth had an unusual wear pattern of a little groove down the tooth. And they suggested that maybe this lady was in some ways working threads or pulling threads through their mouth. And I can identify that in a strange sort of way, that I do a bit of fishing. Sometimes I would bite the line, and you're told not to bite the line. Maybe you bit it enough, you would get a little knots in your teeth. So something to look out for in the archaeological record. But why the burial became so interesting is from the DNA and isotope analysis. Because this demonstrated that this female burial, was not of somebody from Ireland, it was of Scandinavian origin. So it was a female Viking burial. And they were buried with 2 metal objects. And what we're looking at now is just one view, 3 views of one object. And these are known really as copper alloy brooches or oval brooches. And there normally is a pair, and they're normally only worn by women and turning up in female graves. And these undecorated examples, although they have suffered a bit from corrosion, are very, very early in date. What happens is that through time, they evolve and they become highly decorated, like the examples in the bottom of the screen. And those examples are from Ballyholme, and a burial found in 1903 near Bangor, a female burial. So antiquarian find, we don't know a whole lot about it, but really, really important find. And you can see how the brooches may have been worn. So there was one single oval brooch that was almost certainly from a pear, but it was made of copper and over 300 years doesn't classify as treasure. But the other object is equally interesting, and it's a circular mount. And when we use the term mount in archaeological terms, it indicates that this object was mounted or attached to some larger object, and it has now become detached. So that's what we mean really by the term mount. And we would know by looking at this mount, it probably was part of an important religious object, perhaps a book shrine. Although it has, it's made of copper and it has what's like gilt, so it's little bits of gold, but not significant enough for it to classify as treasure. But what's interesting about it, it has been repurposed as a brooch by the addition apparently of pins at the back. And that's not really completely unusual in Viking archaeological terms. They often repurpose the gold jewellery. So you imagine then if this had just been discovered, we would be going up to the coroner's court and we were suggesting that this should be classified as treasure under, say, for the new definition of significance. And here are the main reasons why. First of all, Viking burials from the north of Ireland are incredibly rare, and this is one of the first excavated examples. We'd be able to demonstrate that the deceased was of Scandinavian origin. Even more interesting is that the first recorded raid in Ireland is considered to be in Rathlin Island in the year 795, and we do find other Viking objects in Rathlin Island. But the radiocarbon dates from the burial place this perhaps even earlier than 750 AD. So it's predating this main phase of Viking raids, which makes it highly significant. Although the oval brooch is plain, this is the first of its type known outside of Scandinavia. And interestingly, the mount has been also adapted to be worn as a brooch, which makes it unusual. So when you put all these things together, you would be arguing that the grave goods provide exceptional insights to manufacture, artistic styles, and rarity, while overall the burial sheds new light on a period pivotal to Irish history. And it does all those things. And we would get the coroner degree, it would be declared treasure, and we could have guaranteed that we had access to it. But we must point out that the landowner was very, very cooperative in allowing us to acquire the object. So I think you've probably bombarded really enough now with treasure. I'm not sure if you can remember any of the details of what classifies as treasure or not, but if you don't, you're in good company. So thank you very much. The photograph of O'Hanlon, incidentally, it was taken in Armagh County Museum when he was doing one of the tracing his ancestors. Somebody will know them from Father Ted. So it's not a made up photograph. It did take place.
Great, thank you so much indeed. I think that was a wonderful the legislation, which I think probably I'm not very familiar with really. If you actually try and read it online, it's be going. So thank you for giving us a heads up. Pointers there and showing you some of the absolutely wonderful finds. Would you willing to take a few questions? Okay. Anybody in the room like to ask Greer anything about treasure? Yes, Max.
The Rathlin Island Viking female burial, is that the only Viking burial that we see on Rathlin?
There are some, I believe, antiquarian accounts of other graves. Rathlin has a very famous silver brooch. So there's no doubt that there was activity taking place on the island. And I think there's some suggestion that there probably was a small cemetery in Ireland, in Rathlin. You make a kind of a very, very good point. If you look generally at the Viking archaeology, if you look at places like Dublin, Wexford, Cork, Waterford, and you visited the National Museum, these are all Viking towns. We have plenty of evidence of domestic life, games, clothes, wooden objects, streetscapes. But as you move north, that evidence really decreases. And while we have lots and lots of references to Viking raids, fascinating accounts in the annals, we still don't have an authentic Viking settlement. We know that, for example, there was a fortress that says on Loch May, and Viking burials from the north of Ireland are really rare. The Viking presence, Cormac Burke's here, would be, that's where the Blackwater project became so important in increasing our knowledge of Viking activity. There is the Viking male burial from Larne, which is on display in the Ulster Museum. Then you have the burial found in 1903 of the female burial with the Viking oval brooches. Interesting, obviously, in itself, if we wanted to think of the Vikings only in terms of raids, but we have maybe a female presence suggesting that there must simply have been settlement, but it hasn't been found. But yes, Rathlin seems to be a pivotal point.
Yes. Hello. Of the precious metal items that are found in Ireland, is there any sense of where that metal has been mined, where it has come from? Is it locally mined? Or is that looked at in any way?
Yeah, well, yeah, it has been looked at. Yes, it has been looked at. There are a range of gold sources in Ireland. The gold mines river in Wicklow. Get gold in the Sperrins, you can get gold from Croke Patrick. I visited the detectors just there recently, and I was astounded by the amount of gold he panned in local rivers in County Tyrone. My dentist told me that he would have panned enough gold from the Sperrins to fill a tooth. So gold does exist in Ireland, but what we have to think of, and then you have the deep mines like Dalriada mining. But you have to think about what was really accessible to prehistoric mining technology. And most of it is going to be alluvial gold, gold washed out in streams. If you think of the great gold rushes in the States and Canada, they lasted for a while, but eventually all the easy sources were panned out. So to try to answer your question, what essentially what they tried to do was to look at a lot of the gold sources and analyze the amounts of silver and the trace elements, rather to see if there's like a fingerprint pattern. And then they tried to analyze the gold objects. The period had been done with maybe not a whole lot of great success. And that's because maybe after a while people were mixing metals. We know that maybe there are gold sources, maybe from Cork and Wales, for example, as well. But if you take the fact that Ireland produces so many gold objects, if you remember the value of the carved torque, it was 720 grams. If you remember the example from Wrexham, it was only 92 grams. So, that amount of gold could have made a lot of objects. So I think it really has to be a local source of gold, but whether it was the Sperrins or whether it was the Gold Mines River area in Wicklow, it's hard really to be certain, and there's a debate over it.
Excuse me. The copper and the tin, were they local resources or are they imported?
The main, we know we're reasonably confident on the copper sources, in that there are Bronze Age mines in the Cork and Kerry area, Mount Gabriel. So there are Bronze Age mines that have been excavated in the southwest of Ireland. Tin would appear to have come from Cornwall, but one of the dichotomies is, the north of Ireland has substantial quantities of bronze objects, but it doesn't appear to have, any of the classic Bronze Age mines. But certainly copper appeared to be available, gold appeared to be available. The rare metal of them all was tin. That appeared to be mainly coming, I think, from Cornwall.
You were talking about the metal content of the torque found in Fermanagh. Were you implying, because of the copper content, that the smith was cheating the owner?
Well, yeah, if it had been there in much larger terms, yes. Well, it's about, if you go to buy gold now, are you buying it in, I'm trying to think of now, H.S. Samuels or Ratner's? The amount of silver in the Bronze Age was just a natural element. And while copper does appear, it's only appearing in comparatively small amounts. It needs to appear in large amounts if you wanted to change the color. But whether they knew whether they were adding it deliberately or not deliberately, it's your guess really is as good as mine. But it's interesting when you get to the Iron Age. Talking about maybe a kind of identifying object, Iron Age gold usually has a much higher percentage of silver, where the silver must have been maybe being deliberately added. Bronze Age gold, 16% would be very, very high. So
Is much of the gold that has been found in Ireland of the 24-carat variety, or is it all cheaper stuff down the line?
well, this is my interpretation of it. There isn't really in Western Europe pure gold, 24-carat gold. It just doesn't exist.
Yes.
It does not exist. So if you take the ratio of 5, most Irish gold will have silver between 5 and 16%. So that's taken us down into the lower carats. So the problem with pure, the higher the carat, the softer the metal, and you get to a point that it's easily marked and scraped up. So a lot of the Bronze Ages, I think we have tested are in around that maybe 87% gold mark.
Going back to the Rathlin find in the skeleton, it's not really due to any finds, but does that mean that any development in Rathlin will have an archaeological survey before any foundations are dug or anything like that?
Well, there's a whole, I'm going into Terry's line, not over, but there's a whole publication on on a survey of Rathlin Island. I don't work for the archaeological companies, but when you have any kind of development, there is always meant to be a level of monitoring and mitigation. And obviously, if you have areas within Rathlin that are seen to be important, between any planning development, in theory, there should be archaeological input. So yeah, Rathlin would be important, and you would expect people to have to go through the whole planning process. And that's why we're saying that this particular landowner was very, 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 very helpful.
What essentially happens to artifacts that aren't declared? Like, how many of these artifacts end up going missing, and how do they go missing from the Irish sort of collections?
Well, in the past, a lot of the museum is founded on a number of big archaeological collections. The Reverend Canon Granger, a lot of them were clerics, and a lot of people in the past had to have a bit of money, and some of these collections were dispersed. In terms of the reporting of objects, we can only deal with what is reported to us. We do know that finds do circulate, and by word of mouth and even by photographs, and objects really aren't handed in. But I suppose I don't look at myself as a kind of a police officer trying to regulate that. You're depending on, so to a certain extent, of people's goodwill in declaring fines. It's hard to say. It's hard to say what percentage is not declared.
I'm just curious because I remember being told a story a long time ago. I think it was 3 large trumpets or something being found at the stables at the time of sexing, and then they just disappeared.
Okay, that would have been then. They would be the Loch Nashade. They would be the Loch Nashade trumpets. But you remember, a lot of these finds take place in the 1800s. So one of the Loch Nashade trumpets survives. It's on display in the National Museum. But there was a whole antiquarian industry in the past, and they used collectors, and they called these collectors ragmen. So they used to travel all around the country, buying up bits and pieces. And it said, it's something I don't know a little bit about it. You said, like, the ragmen would never hesitate to invent a story how it was found in a rath or a castle or something. I thought that would increase the valuation of it. But it's not really uncommon for sort of older antiquarian finds to be known, and some of them to be dispersed and going missing, and collections just sold on. But I suppose there wasn't, a lot of them, if you want to call them museums, there were private collections then, and often when the owner died, they were dispersed. But there's one of the Loch Nashade trumpets is on display in the National Museum, and I'm lucky enough to have heard a replica played in the Ulster Museum there recently. So.
You're allowed to what is the market value, you know? I see the cost to determine that. Follows on from what was, you know,
Yeah, well,
about objects not being handed over. You know.
well, if you're student enough, you can look at certain publications, and certain publications might give the values or the value of the object. The objects are valued, and the objects are valued independently by it's called the Treasure Valuation Committee, sit in the British Museum. It doesn't, as I say, we've been sometimes accused that, oh, you value the objects yourselves. It's not people from the British Museum valuing the objects. They will use external people, basically in the antiques trade. Now, if you had found an object, when you get the valuation, you get a report as to why they came to that. No, I wouldn't divulge, obviously, I wouldn't divulge what was paid for individual objects, except that most of the time, they are not worth large amounts of money. You know, it's very, very rare to find something that's worth a real large amount of money. Like, if you're at like some of the Bronze Age gold, yes. Even some of the Viking material, you'd be surprised at the valuations. You know, sometimes they're more common in England and stuff. But I thank goodness that we are not involved in valuing. But again, we don't have endless amounts of money to pay for them. So if an object does come in, like the card torque, there'd be a bit of panic as to where you're going to get the money from. And in the end of the day, if the museum can't come up with the money, the object's handed back.
Have you ever found any treasure yourself? Or are you not like to answer that?
No, well, I was involved. I was involved in one time in the Blackwater project, monitoring metal detecting. And I would probably describe my ability with the metal detector as similar to my ability fishing. Not very good, but you know, other members of staff have been much more successful in finding elements of the Clonmore Shrine, for example, an object that incidentally doesn't classify as treasure. But working on the Blackwater was a very, very interesting and eye-opening project. And most of these objects, we make no bones about it. All the objects you've seen there are found metal detecting.
Have there been any prosecutions, Greer? You know, how much of a return is the Treasure Act? You know, has been much of a follow-up to things? Does it really deter the detectorists or
well,
treasure hunters?
There has only been there's been one. If somebody asks you a question, you have to give the honest answer. There has only really been one case that went to court, and the detectives won the case. We're not going to the technicalities of the argument, but life can be funny sometimes, because the same detectives many years later ended up in jail because he had possession of stolen archaeological goods on them. I think really, you know, some people may know that both from the museum and HED's point of view, you know, we're looking into the minute of the whole role of detecting and what is the best way to take it forward. And if it was, for want of a better term, maybe to become more licensed or liberalized, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I think then there would be a much greater onus on, perhaps, for want of a word, you know, taking people to court that then were really breaking the law. It is a kind of a minefield area at the moment, because it's legal to detect in England and Wales. It's technically speaking not legal to detect. It's not legal here to search for archaeological objects.
The Cambain coin hoard, what was the context of that discovery? And
it's just like a classic term, is that it was found. It was found really in a farmer's field. Two boys were detecting, and I can't remember the exact distance, but the nearest monument, but not within a field or two, was Cambain Castle. And, you know, just classic, like all these finds, just nothing else appeared to come out of the ground. Of course, all the 84 coins were removed. That's really all I can tell you. I was up, up and visited the site. The boys that found it, I think, got a bit carried away and went to a local bar and phoned the BBC, and there was a bit of a hoot.
The container or a bag?
No, they said there was no bag or container. And any of the coin hoards that we have been reported, and there's no reason for anybody not to say to you, but one of the questions that, for example, the coroner asks, was there anything of relevance near the find? And obviously, if you're dealing with coin hoards, you'd be looking out for a basket or a container, but nobody has ever said, sometimes we'd get the coins all stuck together.
Yeah.
And that would be a good indication that they might have been in the purse. Other times you will get the coin hoard scattered, but the conveyed coin hoard was contained within a very, very small area. So suggesting it was, maybe buried in the container.
What would be its monetary value in the mid-17th century,
I don't know off the top of my head, but the report by Robert Heslop did say it. But I know you would ask me an awkward question. Like
No.
Worth a reasonable amount.
For
Well,
interest,
84 silver coins, like it must have been worth a reasonable amount of money.
No, just some very interested in Kinbane Castle and
Yeah.
1640s archaeology, that's why.
But they think that it maybe belonged to a soldier, but there's a story that I think was maybe some occupant associated with the castle murdered a Jennifer Spears who had silver coins in a stocking or something, so there's it's in the Colin Breen was drawing my attention to that, but most likely it belonged to
Not a bad castle,
no, this was maybe it's a hypocritical story.
And is it different metals like gold and silver? Modern metal detector, are they more accurate or is gold not especially visible?
Look, from my limited experience, and it was many years ago in the 80s and 90s, well, the machines have evolved since then, and the precious metal objects will give a much more distinct sound, really sometimes like a high-pitched sound, whereas iron objects will give a different sound. And there's also discriminator levels on the machines. So if you were in a field that has a lot of little fragments of iron, you could discriminate out the iron objects and set it just to detect precious metals. But I'm not the person really to ask in terms of the technicalities of modern metal detecting machines, except like everything, they're getting better and better and better.
Thank you.
Suppose I were to be lucky enough to find, say, a gold brooch.
Yes.
Should I be advised to sort of bury it again, not disturb it, and contact the museum or somebody?
Probably
Dig it out yourself.
well, usually by the time that you've got it in your hand, you'll have dug it out. It will have come out. Human nature is not going to necessarily put the object back into the ground. It's really what we find is people think they can take you back to the exact spot, but quite often they can't. So it might sound a bit primitive, but even some way maybe even marking where exactly it was found. Ideally, if you started to pull out a whole lot of coin hoards, a lot of coins, you might want to stop and contact HED or the museum and see if we can come out and excavate the site. But that, in my experience, I don't know about any, that has really not. It has happened to a certain extent retrospectively. For example, with the Carrrr Torque, with the Murloc hoard, but it has never happened at the time.
Other questions?
Greer, your old 1971 Morrison Marina. We used to go to digs in up in Carnarvon and that. If you found that outside in the street today, would it be treasure?
Well, I don't know about the old Morris Marina, Jerry, but I did go up and went up in style, and at one stage I owned a Ford Capri, which is not apparently something to be proud of, because apparently you just see my little head and the big bonnet, you know. But yeah, so it's funny when you come back. Jerry and I started doing archaeology together in 1978. Of course, I've worked with Cormac Burke as well. So yeah, the old Morris Marina used to leak water, and it wasn't a great car. So, more fit for the scrap heap than the treasure.
In that case, we've to say thank you again to Greer for a very interesting lecture indeed. Educated about what treasure actually is. Thank you very much indeed. Before you go, a couple of announcements. Firstly, your the UAS subscriptions for 2025 are now due, or even though they were due on the 1st of January. So if you haven't yet paid your sub for this year, we appreciate it if you could do it as soon as possible. Our treasurer is up the back. If you're happy to take money from you this evening, otherwise please get it to him as soon as possible. So we don't have to keep chasing you. And remember that although our lectures are free for all, any of the UAS activities are members only, and if you haven't, you don't have to have them. So it's a little encouragement, please, to sort out your subs as soon as you can. Secondly, our AGM is coming up next month on the 24th of January. And I know AGM is not everybody's favourite occupation month, and they're rather dull, but I hope as many of you as possible will come along and have your votes for voting in committee, if you want to join the committee. If you would get your names to the Honorary Secretary as soon as possible. On board and lead the in the committee. Otherwise, I'd say thank you for coming out on a rather dirty evening, and I'd like to say another big thank you for your thank you.